So today we're going to be talking about chapter 25, section 3, all about the spread of industrialization. We'll be talking about how it began in Great Britain. Well, yes, it wasn't long before this trend of industrialization and mass production spread to the other parts of the world. But the important thing we are gonna try to take away from today is why and how it spread to not only mainland Europe but also the United States. The first section and the first area we're to look at is the United States. And it's somewhat ironic that the United States haven't broken away from Great Britain. It would actually have some of the same physical and metaphysical advantages that allowed Great Britain to have the Industrial Revolution to take root. Namely lots of land, there was available labor from farmers and immigrants, and of course the natural resources. So the ironic thing to continue that trend that actually brought United States industrialization into what we would call its own industrial revolution was when the British blockaded the United States during the War of 1812. A blockade is where you encircle an area and basically try to starve them or put them in force, the United States, to actually become more reliant on their own industry and by not allowing industrialized goods to come into the United States. It's poured in the United States to create their own textile factories and their own factories to produce cannons, guns, and all the things they will need in order to fight a war and basically just to live a regular life. So again, to just use the term ironic, the British were hoping to actually subvert and hurt the economy of the US, but it actually strengthened them by encouraging them to become more autonomous and independent. So, industrialization in the United States similar to what happened in Great Britain. All of the bad things that we've been discussing, the poor environment, the exploitation of children and women, and especially the pollution, all of those things carried through the United States, and it wasn't by design. The British actually worked really hard to keep those ideas from coming in US. They actually banned engineers and mechanics that work in those factories and those intricate machines from leaving the country, and especially the ideas themselves. So no blueprints were ever allowed to leave the country. The Spanish did this during the colonial period with certain crops like tobacco. They made it illegal to sell it to foreigners. They were trying to create a monopoly basically on this new industry, but because a couple of people basically cheated the system, like Sam Slater, came to the United States. American industrialization began when a British worker assembled a machine in the US in 1813. Francis Cabot Lowell mechanized and put machines into every step of the textile process and basically built 2 towns in Massachusetts around these mills. Lowell hired thousands of girls who worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and lived by strict rules. They did earn more money than at home, and sometimes a decent alternative to being a servant. Other aspects of the clothing industry industrialized as well. It wasn't until later, especially during the Civil War, when the United States really took off in dust, and you'll see this happen a lot with full-scale wars like World War I and World War II. Actually, provided economic booms to the United States when it really encouraged people to come up with novel ways to kill people for lack of a better explanation. So the United States from the War of 1812 was encouraged to industrialize, and then during the U.S. Civil War 50 years later, um, it really came into its own in terms of becoming industrial superpower. And then in the 20th century, World War I and World War II would make US a global juggernaut in terms of industry. Alright, so we've been practicing something over the past years, over the past couple years in the stock market, where you guys have theoretically invested money in corporations. This is a throwback to the early days of capitalism. Now, modern capitalism now, where you could buy individual stocks or shares of companies and you would get ownership. When you did that, you would split the profits with anybody else who has invested in the company, but you could also split the risk. So it encouraged people like John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie to take more audacious risks. Then the argument could be made that if they were investing their own money in these business opportunities, so corporation kind of had a two-way street. It encouraged more bold investment opportunities, but it also helps spread the profit, one could argue. After the Industrial Revolution was able to spread across the end of the English Channel, the rest of the continent had to kind of keep up in terms of competition and just maintaining an economic sense of equilibrium across the continent. The Napoleonic Wars between 1789 and 1815 had set the rest of Europe back a lot, and rulers wanted to catch up to England's progress because they knew industry meant power. So we are going to start with Belgium, which is across the English Channel. If we were to pinpoint one place where the Industrial Revolution was able to take hold first, then we are going to start there in Belgium. So just like in the United States, a British mill worker smuggled industrial secrets and technology into Belgium and basically put some of the first factories there. You also notice that Belgium has a fairly large and fairly spread out river network, just like Great Britain, which allowed for the transportation of goods and natural energy, so on and so forth. But it was Germany that really harped on industrialization. They imported their engineers from Great Britain. They sent German children actually to England to be educated. Railroads were built to link Germany's industries, as well as Germany's grew their military apparatus. It became huge, which is going to be a really important precursors to World War I. So, so the impact of industrialization, there is a rise of global inequality, wherein one could argue that it widened the gap between the rich and poor, while at the same time, it also created a middle class. Industrialized also tied industrialized and non-industrialized countries together. And imperialism spreads due to need for raw materials. That Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, and later the US all had colonies or territories that it used for raw materials and new markets. So it did transform society, and it changed the way people had. Industrialization gave Western Europe tremendous power and wealth, while Africa and Asia lived in agricultural poverty. Despite hardships in the short term, in long-term effects of industrialization eventually improved the lives of people in terms of luxuries, health, and life expectancy. The middle class growth allowed its children access to education and opportunities for participating in governments. This participation paves the way for reforms that further improve life for urban factory workers. Reforming the industrial world, wherein the Industrial Revolution leads to economic, social, and political reforms. The first thing we need to talk about is our philosophers, that they start to respond. So first is Adam Smith, which he is actually a man of the Enlightenment. But it wasn't really until the Industrial Revolution that these ideas started to sink in and support of what some of these industrialists were doing. So Adam Smith is sort of responding to that. He wanted something that lays a fair or let people do as they please. This was an economic policy. Right of letting owners of industry and businesses just go without direct business practices. Working condition without any interference from the governments. And so he take about these ideas in the Wealth of Nations, and he called it another name as a free market economy. There were natural laws, these forces out there, and so Adam Smith applied it to the economics, and he thought people were truly free who would see economic progress, and so there are the laws that needed to be kind of left alone, especially with the law of supply and demand. So if we let people do as they please, everybody will benefit. So we start to see other famous economists. So they sort of had economics becomes known as the dismal science because they had these dire predictions, both Malthus and Ricardo, so two famous economists, at the same time who are also kind of reviving Adam Smith's idea. And so they felt that the poor will increase, the working class will increase if the government helps them. And that's where they started talking about something called capitalism. So capitalism, where free market economy, laissez-faire are often used interchangeably, but they are slightly different. So this is an economic system in which in business ventures to make a profit. So industries are privately owned, and the goal is to make a profit. While some other philosophers though look at it differently, and one of these pro-intervention idea is called utilitarianism. And Jeremy Bentham said that they need to look at their institutions, add ideas, philosophies, and decide if they are useful, utilitarian. And so the government can provide the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Other people like John Stuart Mill were kind of utopian. They thought they could build an ideal society, and So John Mill had a factory, and he came up with this idea that his workers, owners, and the supervisors could kind of work in harmony rather than compete with each other. So probably the most famous or most influential of this pro-intervention is socialism. Socialism is complicated because the world changes over time depending on who you ask. So socialism is a factors of production land, labor, and capital owned by the public operated for the welfare of all, wherein government should plan the economy, and if they do that, poverty will come to an end and everybody will be equal. Um, there's a lot of socialists, but the most famous is Karl Marx. And he introduces something called radical socialism, also known as Marxism. And he outlines these ideas in the Communist Manifesto. Karl Marx is a philosopher and studies history, and he sees that it's a conflict between the haves and the have-nots. So throughout history, you see this conflict that the haves have kind of exploit the have-nots. He saw that the Industrial Revolution made this problem even worse. So Karl Marx has a solution. This is his radical socialism. So in this case, in the Industrial Revolution, he's gonna call the working class the proletariat, and for Karl Marx, they are the have-nots. So yung proletariat is they are the have-nots, while the bourgeois are the middle class. The bourgeoisie are the middle class, and they are the haves. So yung proletariat, sila yung have-nots, and bourgeoisie, sila yung haves. And so eventually, most of the world are really the proletariat. Most of the world is proletariat. He says this is gonna become a global thing, and they eventually will overthrow and haves will overthrow the haves. So magkakaroon na sinasabi ni Karl Marx ang magiging mag-overthrow sa world ay mga haves or yung tinatawag na bourgeoisie. And when that happens, and again, he sees it as a global international movement, then that will equal communism. Communism is a form of complete socialism where the means of production, capital, factories, land, and businesses owned by the people, and that there was no private property, but ideas as everybody is equal, and that there's a redistribution of wealth and everybody has an equal share. So these are the idea of these philosophies that influence people. In North and South, the workers themselves took matters in their own hands, and they responded to these changes, and so they started to form unions. This was a organization of workers, and they would call for strikes, that they would threaten to stop working, and it became a powerful tool. It forced the owners of the factories to listen to their demands. And so what would the first managers the managers negotiate, and this is called collective bargaining. The negotiations between employers and the workers, it will have this is called the collective bargaining. So unions are forming, and for much of its history they are illegal, and so sometimes they did this and could get arrested, but eventually governments acquiesced to give into this and saw that unions were making changes. So the point was to go on strike, to force people to collective bargain, and that they could maybe get things they wanted. So politicians also responded. Um, they become aware of some of the more horrific qualities. This is in Great Britain, of course, parliamentary laws that go into place because they started do studies and they learned about the um, terrible conditions in the mines. And so one thing is that they address, of course, uh, the mine workers' conditions and the young people. They start to limit child labor, how young could all work, and by limiting the amount of time that people work. This is also the time in history when women start to enter into the political world, and so they saw some of these social ills. They responded it. A lot of women in the early mid 1800s led abolition movements to the end of slavery, and of course their main drive was suffrage. Suffrage right, or the right to vote. This was a long fight that they didn't achieve until the 20th century. So the governments and societies also have to look at how they would reform people, and so public schools, by this point, by the mid 1850s, in the United States, throughout much of the Europe and other places, they started to encourage public education because you could then have a smarter workforce. Also, prisons, they thought that they could reform people through prisons.